My name is Jennifer Chaika. I'm the Programs and Exhibits Manager at the Arlington Heights Memorial Library. With me tonight are Megan, a librarian and program specialist, and Allison, a librarian in our info department and program superstar. So we are very happy to have Linda Gartz here with us tonight. Linda can say hello.
Hi.
With that, I'd like to go ahead and I'd like to thank Linda for being here. I'd also like to thank the book stall, who is helping us out with some co-sponsorship, and they do have copies of the book available, so thank you so much to the book stall for having those. And then I'd like to tell you a little bit about Linda, and then she's going to get started. Linda Gartz is the 6-time Emmy-honored documentary producer, author, blogger, educator, and archivist. Her award-winning book, Redlined, connects the dots between today's racial profiling and inequities to the government policy of redlining. Her documentaries and TV productions have featured on ABC, NBC, CBS, PBS, and Investigation Discovery. Her educational videos include Begin with Love, hosted by Oprah Winfrey, and Grandparenting, hosted by Maya Angelou. No small names there. Gartz's articles and essays have been published in literary journals, online, and in local and national magazines and newspapers, including the Chicago Tribune. Born in Chicago, Linda studied at both Northwestern University and the University of Munich, and she has lived most of her adult life in Evanston, Illinois. Of course, tonight, she's going to be talking to us about her formative years. Linda, I wanted to pass it to you and thank you for being here tonight. I may have cut off the end of your introduction, but I wanted to let everybody know that while you are currently a resident of Evanston, where you've lived most of your adult life, we're going to be hearing about your formative years in West Garfield Park as told through this memoir. So thank you, Linda.
Okay, well, thank you, Jennifer, so much for introducing me and for having me. I want to also thank the team that's behind the scenes, Allison Lowry and Megan Young, and of course also thanks to the book stall for helping to sponsor this. So I wanted to start out just by acknowledging this very tumultuous moment we're all living in, as you know. I mean, we've been living with the coronavirus now and our shutdowns for several months, and we've seen American deaths reach almost 130,000. And it's sad to say that African Americans are dying from the coronavirus at twice the rate that whites have been. And we can draw almost a direct line from that fact to the redlining that has occurred over the last several decades. And then we've experienced the murder of George Floyd and the instantaneous protests that have arisen worldwide because of that. And what's been heartening to see in those protests is that these are all races protesting, all ages protesting. It's very different from the kinds of protests that went on after Martin Luther King was killed in 1968. And I have to say that some of the protests that were going on in Chicago, a few bad actors in my old neighborhood decided to do some looting, and they were looting in stores that literally were a block away from where I grew up. And that was kind of like a deja vu moment for me because it took me back to 1968 after Martin Luther King had been killed. And we had devastating riots, and sometimes they're called uprisings, on the west side of Chicago. And those were so devastating. I would like to just show one photograph of the aftermath of those riots. It was this is a picture of one section of the west side of Chicago, and there were about 28 blocks that looked like this after the 1968 riots. There were conflagrations that reminded one of World War II, let's say the bombing of Dresden. Not that bad, but I mean, you saw flames licking up 2 and 3 stories high for as far as you could see, and firefighters trying to control it. And the result was the next day, this is what vast swaths of the west side looked like. And then came in the bulldozers to tear down what remained of these charred remnants of the buildings. And then those areas were just left as vacant lots. And even today, you can go to the west side and you will see many vacant lots 52 years later. So give me 1 second. So this was a pent-up rage that was going on. And in 1968, my parents still owned small apartment buildings on the west side. We owned a 6-flat and 2 2-flats. And we have an image of the 2-flat that I grew up in. It was a gray stone 2-flat, a beautiful building. And my parents bought that building in 1949. There's a picture of it on a snowy day. You can see the Christmas lights around it. It had, you can look closely in the upper parts of each window or leaded glass windows that used to throw prisms of rainbows onto the floor. And when my parents bought this building in 1949, they kind of figured that they would probably be there maybe another 40 years, just like my grandparents who had settled in West Garfield Park in 1912. And they had saved their money obsessively and owned buildings themselves. And so by 1949, they'd been there for over 40 years. But my parents didn't realize at the time that they were living kind of on a fault line of history. And it's that history that actually gets me to my book. Actually, one of the first questions that people often ask me, as they often ask many authors, is what inspired you to write the book? Why did you want to write a book? And frankly, I never had any plan to write a book until sort of a startling discovery occurred. After my mom died in 1994, my brothers and I were cleaning out her home. That was on the north side of Chicago by then. And we were separating trash from treasure, as people do when they're cleaning out a house. And in the attic, we found our gold. We discovered that my parents and grandparents had saved thousands and thousands of pages of letters, diaries, documents, photos, you name it, they saved it. And so we sorted this out into 25 banker's boxes. And if we can just take a look at some of these boxes, that's just a few of them in my garage. And that's where these banker's boxes ended up. I'm the only one who lived in Chicago, so they've got stored in my garage. And they sat there silently holding their secrets for about 8 to 10 years while I got along with the business of raising my 2 boys. I had no time to go look at them. But sometime in around the early 2000s, just a nagging inner voice said to me, gee, I wonder what's in those letters and diaries. I wonder what secrets they hold. So I hauled out the World War II letters. We have about 300 letters from World War II when my uncle was studying to become a navigator on the B-17 heavy bombers at that time. And these were letters between him and his family and friends. And I started reading, and I was instantly whisked back into the 1940s and the home front and what it was like to be a young man trying to pass all the tests that you had to pass to become a navigator. It was very hard. And I was hooked. So I decided to start reading more and more letters. But just to give you a sense of the vastness of this collection, I want to show you one page of a spreadsheet. My brothers and I made a spreadsheet to kind of keep track of what was in the boxes that we had. And this is just one page of about a 10-page spreadsheet where we kind of detailed what the kinds of, what the contents were. And then the next picture is just a teensy-weensy portion of the collection. I spread it out on the floor to take a picture of it. And you can see open diaries, and up in the upper right-hand corner is my dad as a young man. There's a little German cookbook in the left side and a Bible over there with the cross on it. So this just gives you a tiny sampling of what there was. But I was determined to kind of get through this. So I decided that I wanted to start reading my parents' letters and diaries. My dad kept a diary in the 30s and the 50s. My mom started a diary in 1927 when she was just 10 years old. And she kept that diary going her entire life. Those entries here that my mom made in this diary that you see the cover of here were the most fascinating to me. This, my mom was very fastidious. She noted on every diary what the dates were that were included. And in this diary are her entries about meeting and falling in love with my dad. And they, to me, were the most tantalizing. So here's what I found out. In May of 1941, my mom went downtown to Ontario and Dearborn. There was Moose Lodge there. The building is still there. for a dance. That was very typical of young people back in the 1940s. There'd be a big band playing, and young people would go there to meet a guy or a gal for the evening, or who knows, maybe for life. So my mom went to this dance in May of 41, and whom should she see there but Fred Gartz. She had met him a few months earlier at a dance, and they'd had a marvelous time, but he never called her for a date. So she thought, great, second chance. So she goes up to him, he invites her to join the group. They fall into conversation. The whole room seems to disappear until they finally dance, and they dance the night away. And when my mom gets home, she writes this in her diary. You have to see, this is just the second time they've met. There's no doubt about it. I'm in love with him. We'll get to this, the diary entry that's on the page here in just a minute. So what she writes that night is, there's no doubt about it. I'm in love with him. He's really the first man I've met that I think I'd like to marry. Intelligent, crazy, fun, and we have no end of things to talk about. Well, with that kind of attitude, you'd think my dad would have picked up on her vibes, but I think he was a little slow on the uptake, and it took him about 3 months to ask my mom out for a date. So finally they set the date for August 15th, 1941. They go to a movie, they take a nice walk in the summer breezes of Lincoln Park, which all of you are, I'm sure, familiar with. There's a zoo there, of course. And then they go to a brewery and have a couple of frosty beers, and then they go back to the park. And when my mom gets home from that date, she writes this in her diary. I'm going to read directly from my book. I think we both knew why we went back to the park. We sat on a bench hearing the lion's roar and the quacking of a duck. Oh, it was heavenly. And here we now see her handwriting, which I think it's kind of fun, especially if you're a younger person. You don't see much handwriting anymore. And she writes, he knows all the little innuendos, and you see that word up there at the top. He knows all the little innuendos of kissing. And I ain't so bad myself, if I do say so. We kissed for about an hour and a half. I find that rather amazing. Tonight was like a page from a storybook, and he definitely is the man I want to marry. Dear God, please let it come true. Well, these kind of ecstatic entries go on for the next several months as they continue dating. And my dad's a little, more reticent than my mom. He's always has been a little more emotionally withheld. But finally, in May of 1942, he finds his voice, and my mom writes what happened. Fred told me at 2:30 a.m., Sunday, May 17th, really that he loves me. One split second before he did so, I murmured, je t'aime. But of course he did not understand. Ever since then, we have been happier than ever before in our lives. Fred tells me the nicest things, that he loves me more all the time, that I get sweeter as time goes by, that he's never loved anyone the way he loves me, that he has wanted many things badly in life, but never anything half as much as he wants me. We have never had an argument since our first date on August 15th, 1941. So if we won't be happily married, who will? Well, that was young love. And this is a picture of my mom and dad in one of their early dates. This was actually their third date, and that's North Avenue Beach. I figured out where that was based on diary entries because the picture wasn't labeled. But, they looked like a cute couple from the 1940s. And my mom was sure by May of 1942 that they would be happily married forever. And they got married that November. Well, when I was a teenager, I'm sorry to say, my parents were definitely not happy. My mom was screaming at my dad, and my dad was withdrawing or throwing out subtle zingers to get her even angrier. And as a teenager, I found this very distressing. I wondered what happened to my parents' marriage after I read these beautiful diary entries. And I thought maybe if I read the diaries and the letters, I could try to figure out what happened to their relationship. But there was another question that I wanted to answer, and that is what happened to my neighborhood? And for that, I needed to do some more research. Why, when one African-American family moved onto our block, did all the whites flee by the thousands? And I mean by the thousands. Our neighborhood emptied out of whites, and African-Americans moved in. Within a few months, we were one of the last white families in the neighborhood. So in order to find the answer to that question, I couldn't go to the diaries. I had to go do some pretty deep research. And in doing so, I discovered redlining. And I will talk a little bit about what redlining was. I'm going to do that by reading a little portion of my book called Redlined. And this is the section that deals with what the Great Migration was. And I'm going to just hold up a picture that I will later show you. It's a little reversed. But let me start by reading this section of the book. Like most major cities in 20th century America, Chicago was rigidly segregated. African Americans were clustered primarily on Chicago's west side and in the south side's Black Belt, which was a strip of land that stretched from about 28th Street down to 70th Street in 1940 and inexorably expanded as Blacks flocked to the city. Chicago's Black population had been burgeoning in these two neighborhoods ever since the beginning of the Great Migration, when vast numbers of Southern Blacks moved to the northern states in California, starting near the end of World War I and gaining steam in the second wave after World War II. Now, at this point, I want to show you the picture that I have in my book. This is a photograph of a family that had migrated to Chicago in about 1920. That was a year after the Chicago had their devastating race riots. And for a long time, nobody knew the history behind this picture. But then the Chicago Defender, which many of you may know of, it's an African-American newspaper that was started around 1900, and it was one of the main reasons that Blacks came to the North. And a person with WBEZ's Curious City did some deep research, and they discovered this article that was written in the Defender about this, and this gave us the history of this family. And you'll see the headline, "Family Driven from the South by Mob, 8 Victims of the Lynch Law." Well, it turns out, and notice it says burned 2 ex-soldiers. These were two African-American men who were veterans, but they were accused of killing a white man. And so they were hunted down. They lynched at least one of them and burned the other one. Meanwhile, the rest of the family had to try to flee for their lives, and they finally escaped and somehow made it to Chicago. But this kind of example gives you a pretty good idea why African Americans wanted to get out of the South and come north. And that was the driving force behind the Great Migration. So I'm just going to continue to read a little bit more about that section. Hold on. In the 1940s and 50s, 3 million Blacks fled north from the daily degradations and abuses of the Jim Crow South. Hundreds of thousands headed to Chicago, where the Black population nearly tripled from almost 278,000 in 1940 to more than 812,600 in 1960. So it tripled in those 20 years. Like my parents, many whites remained unaware that this massive population shift was underway, or the reasons behind it. They just knew they didn't want African Americans moving into their white neighborhoods. Most whites were certain that Blacks brought decay and dilapidation into every community they entered. When I was young, we sometimes drove through African American neighborhoods on our way elsewhere, and we witnessed blight firsthand. Sagging porches, dirty windows, no grass, only twisting weeds and dusty front yards and ill-clad little children playing in the street, often with no adults nearby. A ferocious white backlash erupted when Blacks moved into an all-white area. In July of 1953, a Black couple purchased a home in all-white South Deering on Chicago's South Side. For months, white crowds protested and rioted, hurling bricks, shooting off pistols, and attacking and injuring Black passersby. One of the picketers proclaimed to a CBS reporter that she didn't want Blacks coming into her community because, and I quote, "Every place they've taken over, they've turned into a slum," end quote. Whites were certain that Blacks would devastate their communities, and alongside that would destroy whites' greatest investment, the value of their homes. In her epic book about the Great Migration, called The Warmth of Other Suns, Isabel Wilkerson writes, "It was an article of faith among many people in Chicago and other big cities that the arrival of colored people in an all-white neighborhood automatically lowered property values. That economic fear was helping propel the violent defense of white neighborhoods. The fears were not unfounded, but often not for the reasons that people were led to believe. Years later, I learned that the real culprits behind the decrepitude and lowering value of white homes were the policies of the federal government in alliance with the real estate and mortgage sectors. In the 1930s, the newly created Home Owners Loan Corporation, abbreviated HOLC, H-O-L-C, along with the Federal Housing Administration and other government agencies, began ranking communities to assess their creditworthiness from A, green, through D, red. And so what I'd like to do now, I'm going to go off the book and we're going to take a look at a color key that shows exactly how these neighborhoods were rated. And this gives you a sense, this map of the United States can give you a sense that this is not unique to Chicago at all. What we can see is that HOLC graded each neighborhood by these four colors. A was the best, like go, give them a loan, that's fine. You can be sure it was an all-white neighborhood. The housing stock was good. Then blue was still desirable. Yellow was called definitely declining, so that was, getting a little risky there. But D was called hazardous, and it was colored red or outlined in red, either way. Most of the maps that I'm going to show you, you will see that it was actually colored in red. And if you look at the map across the city, from Seattle in the northwest down to Miami in the southeast, Chicago, the eastern coast has so many cities that have been redlined that it looks like a bursting star. And you can see that a lot of the cities were actually red and yellow. So let's take a look at a map of Chicago. I can only show a portion of this map because, as you know, Chicago is a long city along the lakefront. So this is a section of Chicago that's between downtown and north and just a little bit south. And I've put an arrow over to the left there. It says my house, where I grew up, that two flat I showed you earlier. And you can see downtown is way at the right. And you can draw almost a direct line from downtown Chicago, because we lived on Washington Boulevard. It's the same Washington as downtown, all the way to my house. So we were just 5 miles from the center of the city. And you can see in this map that, and if you could see the whole map, most of Chicago is red and yellow. And those areas that were red, nobody could get a loan in those areas, neither whites nor blacks. So there could be many reasons a neighborhood was colored red. The housing stock could be poor. Sometimes these maps were prejudiced against immigrants. Sometimes they say in the commentary, Italians moving in. So, there were many different people that were discriminated against, but for sure, if one African-American lived in a neighborhood, that neighborhood was redlined and nobody could get a mortgage in that neighborhood. Well, the whites could leave. They would flee and go to somewhere northwest in the city or further away, but the African-Americans couldn't get a mortgage. Once the whites left, they could get a mortgage. I'll show you now a close-up of a kind of a zoomed-in portion of that same map into my neighborhood, West Garfield Park. And there again, I have the orange arrow that points to my street, Washington Boulevard, and those X's represent the commercial district of the West Side. And that's where I told you that I saw that looting occurred just in the last month on Madison Street. And when, after Martin Luther King had been murdered, those are the areas, and continuing east from those X's was the area that was just completely devastated by the riots. Now those X's, as I mentioned, were a commercial district. Madison and Pulaski was a huge commercial district, and it was very vibrant. It was like a small town. You could buy almost anything you wanted there. There were hardware stores, bakeries, multiple clothing stores. It was just a great place to live in a great commercial area. But after the riots, all the businesses left and it became just an economic nothing. There was no economic base at all. So what I discovered with these maps and the redlining is that most neighborhoods that were redlined back in the 1930s and 1940s are still neighborhoods that are segregated today. Those are the most that's where most African Americans have been clustered, and it's pretty much stayed that way since these maps were created. And that's had many dire consequences for African Americans. And one of the most terrible things that happened is because African Americans couldn't get a mortgage, if they wanted to own a home, the only way they could own a home was to buy it on contract. And a contract sale was kind of like buying an outfit on time. You never owned any equity in the building that you were buying, but you continued to pay towards the loan that you had taken out. And you could pay 50% of what you owed on this loan. And if you missed one payment, the house could be repossessed and the African-American family would be evicted. And many of these unscrupulous real estate dealers at the time could just sell a house over and over again and make a profit on it, because they could just kick the people out after they paid, you know, a vast amount of the value of their loan, and they would never get that money back. These people were sometimes called blockbusters, and the reason they were called blockbusters is because they were accused of busting the block, in other words, selling to African Americans. And they used race baiting techniques to scare whites into selling their homes cheaply, and at the same time, then selling them at maybe 2 times, 3 times the value to African Americans on contract. So they might go to a white family and say, you know, I might offer you $10,000 for your house this week, but maybe next week it'll only be $9,000, you better get out. And we would literally get flyers in our front hallway that would say, get out before it's too late, or get a phone call late at night where the unidentified caller would just say, they're coming. And this is how they race baited white families to sell at low values, and then they could take those homes and sell them at inflated values to African Americans. It's one of the main reasons, because Blacks were not able to invest in property, it's one of the main reasons that today African Americans have about 5 to 7% the wealth that whites have. And wealth is extremely important. It doesn't mean that you're millionaires, but it's just a cushion in case of emergencies such as we're in now. You know, you lose your job and you have some equity in your home that is able to help you. It's wealth you're able to pass on to your children. African Americans have not been able to do that. It's wealth in case of a health emergency. So these are all really important reasons to have wealth, and the main reason that whites have invested in property. It was a great way to be able to save and create wealth. And that wealth has really served white Americans well. In 1968, the Fair Housing Act was passed. And the Fair Housing Act made it illegal to redline any longer. But the problem was that the homes that an African American could have afforded, let's say in 1940 or 1950, had increased in value at a far greater rate than the average salary of an African American. So a house that maybe was worth $3,000 in 1950, let's say that's about $30,000 in today's money, by the 1980s or 2000s would have increased in value to maybe $118,000 or $180,000. By 2000, American homes cost about 8 times the median income, while back in 1950, they were only 2 times the median income. So you can see the vast gap between income and housing costs. So African Americans, for the most part, were pretty much shut out of the housing market and not able to gain wealth and have wealth. And it's a serious problem today. And we still have these segregated neighborhoods that were started because of redlining. So I just want to leave you with one last thought. We'll have a little image here that has my website. If you go on my website, I have lots of resources about redlining. Just click on a book and you'll see a drop-down menu that says resources. There are articles, there are books, there are videos. So if you want to learn more about it, I want to emphasize my book is not an academic book. It is a memoir that interweaves the history of redlining with the story of a family that had boots on the ground before, during, and after the neighborhood's racial change. And for 30 years after the neighborhood's racial change, my parents continued to take care of their buildings in that community as it became more and more poverty-stricken, more and more impoverished. So I hope you'll take a look at that. The other website I have up here is mappinginequality.com, and that's where I got those maps that I showed you. The University of Richmond has digitized maps, redlining maps from about 239 cities around the country. And they're interactive, so you can put in the name of a city and have it pop up, and you can zoom in onto a neighborhood and see what neighborhoods were marked red or yellow, blue or green back in around the 30s and 1940s. So I hope you'll take advantage of that, because and the commentaries that go with these maps is fascinating. One of them, for example, says, threatened with Negro encroachment. I mean, things that sound outrageous today, but at the time that was seen normal. The FHA has in its underwriting manual that, quote, inharmonious racial groups should not live together. So it was the FHA and the federal government that determined that African Americans could not get loans. It didn't matter if you were a veteran or if you had a PhD, African Americans were shut out of the housing market. So with that, I'm just going to kind of wind up and give people a chance to ask questions if you'd like to. And thank you so much for listening.
Excellent. Thank you, Linda. All right, so this is our Q&A portion. We do have a couple questions that came in. If you do have a question for Linda, as Jennifer mentioned this earlier, I was about to say this morning, earlier in the program, the chat box is available down at the bottom of your screen. If you're on a mobile device, just tap your screen and it'll appear, or if you're on a computer, move your mouse. And I am also about to launch a poll, and this is just to see how many people we have watching with us today. So I'll go ahead and do that as you guys think of your questions. And while that is happening, Linda, we do have a question that came in from Jane. Could you talk about redlining in Evanston?
Okay, yes. Well, actually, just a few months ago, we had an exhibit at the Evanston City Hall called Undesign the Red Line. And this is a traveling exhibit that really shows that shows in great detail how redlining worked, and it's interactive. And at that time, Dino Robinson, who's runs a museum here called Shorefront, that chronicles the history of African Americans on the North Shore, had his own map that he had created specifically about Evanston. And Evanston itself was redlined like so many other communities throughout the country. And there was actually a play that was put on in Evanston about a year ago, maybe it's 2 years ago now, it called The House on the Lake. And it was a story about how a lot of African Americans owned property along the lakefront, but the banks would not give African Americans any loans to build their houses. So it actually prevented African Americans from being able to have this, they had the land there, but they couldn't build houses, so they had to sell it. And there was some talk at that time of actually having moved some houses back to what we call now the Fifth Ward in Evanston. So we're a pretty segregated community here in Evanston. We have areas that are more integrated than others, but Evanston, it has this reputation along with Oak Park here in Illinois as being communities that have done a really good job in integrating their communities. But the fact is, I think Oak Park did a better job than Evanston. They had I think it was in 1969, a year after Martin Luther King was killed, they developed a fair ordinance, a fair housing ordinance, and they prevented people from they stopped people from putting up for sale signs, which often frightened people into wanting to move if you saw multiple for sale signs on a block. And they kind of more very consciously tried to integrate the neighborhoods. Both Evanston and Oak Park have integrated schools. And I think our Evanston High School has about 40%, I'm trying to say, 40% African Americans. And Oak Park is also integrated. But interestingly, with all that, there was a documentary that came out about a year or two ago about the Oak Park schools that found that a lot of the African American students felt very much that they felt that they really weren't accepted, and they felt there was racism in the school. So it's a real hard nut to crack. I mean, I can't say that Evanston schools haven't tried. We've had this persistent gap between the achievement of white kids in Evanston and Black kids in Evanston. And it's been going on for years, and they keep trying, they keep trying new methods of approaching this. And it's just been very difficult to make that work. So Evanston, in answer to the question, basically is, yes, schools are integrated. I was very happy that my kids were able to go to school with a variety of races and incomes, gave them a good perspective. But there's still a sense that it hasn't panned out as well for the African American students. So that's just a sad fact.
Thank you, Linda. We have a question from Dawn. What dampened your parents' relationship?
Okay, well, I hope you'll read the book to find out more, because it's a little complicated, but I can just give you a little overview. As I mentioned, that two-flat was purchased in 1949, and that summer, right after we purchased the two-flat, my dad lost his job. And he beat the pavement for 2 months. He had 2 kids, a mortgage, and no job. And he finally was able to get a job with a company called the National Board of Fire Underwriters, which meant that he had to travel for about 6 months out of the year. Not all at once, but he did a lot of traveling, sometimes for a week. In the winter, he'd be gone sometimes 6 or 7 weeks at a time. But he had this image of creating a rooming house. And that's what he wanted to do. And my mom was against it. And I have the letters where she's making very good arguments against it. But for some reason, he just had this bug in his bonnet that he had to have this rooming house. I think he was trying to prove to his parents that he could be successful in the property business like they had been. But it ends up my mother being the person who had to take care of all this while he was gone. We had a coal burning furnace. And then adding to that is my mother, on my mother's side, she had her mentally ill mother living with us, who moved in with them 10 months after they were married. So we had this very psychotic woman living in the home who would attack my father, physically attack my parents. My dad often had to intervene to stop her from hurting my mom. And that put a lot of stress on their marriage. So between those two things, my dad's unrealistic view of letting his wife take care of a rooming house, and my mom's unrealistic view that her husband should be putting up with this really very mentally ill woman in the household for 15 years, all wore away at their relationship, with each side not understanding the other side and not being able to, it wasn't like today where, you wouldn't go to a therapist back in the 50s, or at least you wouldn't hear of it. It would mean you were a weak person. So those are two things I think that really interfered with their loving relationship, because before that two-flat, it seems to me that they were still pretty happy. But you can get the details in the book, which are pretty amazing.
Very good. All right, we have a question from Maureen. Can you talk about redlining and the banks and the stigma that still persists today?
I'm trying to think if she means the stigma of redlining. Well, basically, as I'd mentioned earlier, most of the segregated neighborhoods you see in the country today were neighborhoods that were redlined. And in 1968, the Fair Housing Act was passed. But that didn't mean that redlining actually stopped. You just couldn't say to somebody, I'm not giving you a loan because you're Black. So it went on in much more subtle ways. And one of the things that happened was there was a study that was done by the Reveal, it's called Reveal, the Center for Investigative Reporting, along with the PBS NewsHour, and this came out in 2017. And they took a look at about 30 million mortgages. They crunched them through a computer, and they discovered that even today, whites and whites who have the same financial profile as African Americans, who have about, they control them for the same basic income, or for the same financial background. Whites still are getting mortgages at about 3 times the rate of blacks with the same financial profile. So there's something going on there that is either the banks are looking at the names, or they're looking at the person who walks into their office, or they're looking at the neighborhood. But it doesn't make sense if there isn't some sort of underlying implicit bias going on. And that concept of implicit bias is something that people may not even be aware that they have. You know, they may see the name Tanisha on an application, and just their implicit bias kicks in, and they are wary. There's a wonderful book called Biased by Jennifer Eberhardt. She is a sociologist out of Stanford, and she is often called in by police departments to train them to understand their implicit bias, so that they can try to use different approaches to dealing with people that they encounter of a different color. As we can see, I don't think Chauvin, who killed George Floyd, had very good training in that. But anyway, so that in terms of what's going on today, we still see a lot of leftover consequences of redlining in the neighborhoods that were redlined. There's more pollution. Polluting industries have typically been put more often into black neighborhoods because the whites didn't want them. So we see a lot more health problems among African Americans, a lot of asthma. Black kids have asthma at 3 times the rate that whites do. That means they miss school more. And it goes on and on. So I won't go into that because maybe someone has a question that would address that directly, but I hope that answered the person's question.
Thank you very much. We have a couple questions, and I'm going to try and mush them together. So talking more along the lines of suburbs. So we have Glencoe, which is a rich northwestern suburb, and it had a long history of Black neighborhood, primarily peopled by porters on the Chicago Northwest line. And then we have Arlington Heights. And so can you talk a little bit about how these northwestern suburbs have been affected by redlining?
You know, I think that I would have to look at the map, you know, and I think that would be the best way to take a look at that. Probably these suburbs, you know, the whites could move to the suburbs back in the 40s when redlining was still a thing. You know, and so those areas in the suburbs would have been primarily white because it would be very hard for an African American to afford the cost of a home in those places. So in terms of redlining, I would think it would be in those suburbs, at least if we're talking the 40s and 50s, it would have been an issue of cost and affordability. So, you know, I don't know if they were specifically redlined. I know that the maps that are in mappinginequality.com cover about 239 cities in the country. And I'm not sure they they also include suburbs like that. But, you know, basically I think for suburban living, a lot of that is just, it's a matter of income, and blacks have a far lower income as well as wealth than whites do. I hope that answered that.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. We have a question from Susan asking if part of the problem is the home infrastructure and family support.
The home infrastructure and family support, does she mean in African American communities? Families? Part of the problem, I'm not clear on what problem she's asking me to address. Is it the problem of housing, or, you know, I don't know how to answer that because I'm not sure exactly what the question is.
That is all right. Linda, if you want to clarify. Oh, I'm sorry, Susan, if you wanted to clarify in the chat, we can come back to your question. Let's see, here we go. There's when did you leave the home on Washington Street?
We left that home we moved in 1966. The story behind that, and maybe my friend my best friend from high school, Peggy, is listening in. My friend Peggy, I went to Luther North in the northwest side of Chicago, and my best friend was Peggy, and she lived on Keeler in Montrose. And we were living on the west side, and as far as I could see, my parents weren't even looking for a home. But we were just about the last white family in the neighborhood, and the neighborhood was getting more dangerous. I have to say, my brother was mugged at one point. He had his bike stolen a couple times. So anyway, I'm walking home with Peggy, and I see the house that's next door to her on Keeler for sale. It was this really pretty Victorian house for sale by owners. So I asked my parents, I said, hey, you want to take a look at that house? So we did, and that was in the summer of '65. And we ended up buying that house. And then the following, over Christmas break that year, my brothers and I and the whole family was like steaming off wallpaper, and it was a house that had a lot of work needed, and and then we moved there in 1966. But then my parents rented out our home on Washington, and they would go down there every single week to take care of things. And the city didn't take care of things. I mean, I have one chapter in the book where I have a picture of all the rats my dad killed in the neighborhood, because the city wasn't really taking care of rats. And it was, it got to be a point. My mom had her purse stolen at one point. My dad was held up at gunpoint a couple of times, but they kept at it. They just felt, my mom had this sort of mission. She wanted to show the people that said to her, oh, if you rent to Black people, they're just going to wreck those apartments. And she said, well, I think if we provide good homes and good housing and take care of it, we'll get good tenants. And actually that came to pass. A lot of them were better than a lot of the white tenants they had back in the 50s.
Right. Oh, it looks like we have a comment from Marilyn. She says, I'm interested that your book is a memoir, but entitled Redlined. I have not read your book yet, but I'm looking forward to reading it. You touch on a very difficult and complicated issue, more complicated than just pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. Thank you very much for the resources given.
Oh, well, thank you. And I just want to mention that the full title, it's kind of a long title, is Redlined, a Memoir of Race, Change, and Fractured Community in 1960s Chicago. So what I was trying to do is say, it's redlined, because I am talking about redlining and what happened to the neighborhood, but it's also a family story. And that's what I'm hoping is that, people who maybe wouldn't pick up an academic book on this subject, by picking up an engaging story about a family that they can perhaps identify with, or at least identify with the problems they're facing, that then you will, within that story, get a bit of the history of redlining. I highly recommend, if you're very interested in this subject, that you do get a more academic book. Color of Law is one of the best to really, if you want to delve deeply into how this affected cities throughout the country.
Thank you. Oh, and it looks like we have a recommendation from Marilyn. Are you aware of the artist and architect Amanda Williams? She has painted homes scheduled to be torn down on the on the south side. It's quite provoking, and she's also done a TED Talk about her work. So thank you for that, Marilyn.
Yeah, thank you. What was the name of that again?
The architect is Amanda Williams. And she has done a TED Talk on her work.
Okay, I'll look it up. Thank you.
And we have it looks like a couple follow-up questions from Thomas. So the race riots of 1918 or 1919 was the flashpoint when white beachgoers threw rocks at an African-American young man in the 28th Street block, and the young man drowned. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. Okay. Was that a comment or a question?
They had question marks, so I think they were just clarifying questions.
Oh, yes. Okay. So so last year was the 100th anniversary of the race riots in Chicago, and that's exactly what happened. A young Black teen was accidentally crossed the invisible color line from where he was swimming into an area that was considered the white area of the beach. And so these young white guys threw rocks at him, and he did drown. And when the African Americans tried to get police to help them about that, they instead arrested some of the African Americans. And so then the riots began, and about 37, I don't have the exact number, 36, 37 people were killed, some, both Blacks and whites. they brought in militia, and it was kind of a defining moment. And actually that picture I'd shown of the migrating family from the South, that was from a book that was written in about 1920, which was trying to understand the roots of that race riot. And actually, what's very sad about it is that they were identifying the same issues then that then were addressed by the Kerner Commission. And in 1967, there were all kinds of riots all over the country before King was killed. And they appointed a commission that came to be called the Kerner Commission. And one of the, searingly important comments he made was that, we are developing two societies, one Black, one white, and unequal. And that just came out like February of '68, a few months before Martin Luther King was murdered. And King was murdered on April 4th. And then it was just 10 days later that the Fair Housing Act was passed, because Lyndon Johnson was then, because of the trauma in the Black community, was able to push that through Congress because Southern Democrats were trying to keep that bill from being passed. So finally, the Fair Housing Act, unfortunately, was passed because King was murdered.
We have a question from Janet. Are you aware of any activist organizations that are making headway in confronting present-day biases against Black homeowners?
Well, there are, I know there are legal organizations in Chicago. They are not coming to mind immediately, but my guess is that you just Googled legal organizations helping Black owners, you could find that. I've worked, it was the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights, I think it's called. And there's one group called My Block, My Neighborhood, My City. And that's a group that I'm trying to donate to, because they seem to really be trying to work within neighborhoods to help just get people more resources and be treated more fairly. See, when they look at all the violence that happens in Chicago, they forget that most of the people in these neighborhoods are not creating the violence; they're victims of the violence. So I don't know what this new police chief is doing. He doesn't seem to be offering anything that's very new.
Thank you for that. Sorry, there's so many questions streaming, and I want to make sure that we can get to as many as we can.
Yeah, I'll try to keep my answers short then.
Oh, here is a quick question. So it looks like we have somebody who went to Luther North and wants to know, when you were there, maybe your paths have crossed.
Who knows? I graduated in '66. I don't know when he graduated, this person, if it's a man or a woman, but my friend that I mentioned, Peggy, married Dietmar Faust, who was a year ahead of us, and he was a big basketball star at the school. So if this person graduated, was there around the time, he'd probably remember Dietmar with the unusual German name.
All right, and we have a question from Susan. And she says, is there a difference in family support for education in different neighborhoods? She grew up in Boston. Oh, excuse me, sorry, the question just disappeared. There we go. She grew up in Boston, where busing was a big deal but not successful because children would go to better schools but then go home where family structure did not support education. Is there a way to solve this?
Oh boy.
It's a big question.
If I had that answer, I'd be rich. It is, like a lot of just about like everything in our society, it's a matter of money. And I think what's interesting about this time here, with the COVID-19 crisis, all of a sudden there's money available. I mean, now that there's a crisis that we recognize is affecting the entire country, somehow trillions of dollars have emerged that are able to help people survive. But when we have these neighborhoods like my West Side neighborhood, there's no money to help the neighborhood or support families. A lot of families need extra support. I know there was one experiment in New York. What was that guy's name? Jeffrey Canada, I think. And what his idea was is that these problems are not just a simple problem. There are health problems in these families. I mean, we see that we can see that African Americans are dying at twice the rate that whites from COVID-19. Well, that's because of a host of issues in health. So when you have a family that is struggling with health issues, struggling with monetary issues, because blacks still only make about 57 cents for every dollar that whites make. If you have all these, this whole idea of pulling yourself up your bootstraps, that's great. But if you don't have any boots, you can't do that. So, what's the issue? These are complicated issues, but I think that money would help to have social services and support families better that really can barely afford their rent.
Thank you. And we have time for one more question. Unfortunately, we have a lot of questions coming in, but this will probably be our last one, and it is from Marilyn. How did you organize all of your family history? And how long did it take you to do all of that? We all seem to have a bunch of boxes of family photos and history somewhere.
Well, plan on spending a lot of time. How did I organize it? It was kind of, it emerged. It wasn't like I instantly knew how to organize this. When I started reading the letters, I started kind of just taking notes, but then I realized I had pages and pages of notes, and it would be just as hard to find a quote that I wanted to use. So I started making like a spreadsheet that would have the date, like of my parents' letters, for example. I'd have the date of the letter, who wrote it, and then I'd have different issues across the top of the spreadsheet, like parents, grandparents, housing, tenants. And then I would just put a couple of words in each of those sections that would remind me of the quote that I wanted to use, or what I thought was important. It just took a lot of time. I'd go through the photos and I would sort them out by who was in them. I spent years on this and trying to figure out what the book was going to be about. That really was the hardest thing, because I had so much material. It was like I had an abundance of material, and how do you narrow down the topic? And I finally, after writing about 135,000 words, 300-word book is about 80,000 words, I realized I had to cut out at least 2/3 of it and narrow down to focus on the issue of redlining and the specific issues in my family and how they intertwined. So it's just, there's no simple answer, but there are a lot of books out there. If you Google, organizing my family history, there are people with really, really good organizational skills that have written many, many books, and you could absolutely find some information there.
All right, thank you. Yeah, it would take me way too long to do that. So
last best years of my life.
All right, well, it is 8 o'clock, so I want to thank everybody for coming and asking amazing thought-provoking questions. Thank you to Linda for taking the time to discuss your book and all of the research that you've done. It was great having you, especially at this time when everything is happening in the world. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. And thanks to everybody who came. I really appreciate the outpouring of support for this. So thanks to everybody.
One last shout out to the book stall as well. Thank you to the book stall for co-sponsoring this. And thank you, Linda. This was wonderful.
Okay. Well, thanks again, everybody. It was my pleasure. And I'm just so happy that you're interested. And yes, if you're going to buy a book, if you can buy it from the book stall, please do that.
Thank you, everybody. We'll send out an email to recap the event. We will have a lot of these links that came up in the chat in that email. So we're going to pull together as much as we can for you. There were great book recommendations and things that Linda shared in her questions and answers. So thank you to everybody. This was really a great discussion.
Okay, take care, everyone, and be healthy. Bye.